December 14, 1941, 2:47 a.m. Tamet Airfield, Libya. Oberleutnant Franz Becker stands beside his Messerschmitt Bf 110, running pre-flight checks under floodlights that turn the desert into a stage of harsh shadows and blinding white. The night air carries that particular cold that only North African darkness can produce, a cold that seems to rise from the sand itself, seeping through leather and wool and skin. He does not hear the men approaching. None of them do. What Becker hears, exactly 4 minutes later, is the sound of his aircraft feet's fuel tank rupturing. Not an explosion. A rupture. The wet tearing sound of metal giving way, followed by the chemical stink of high-octane aviation fuel spreading across sand that will ignite like a fuse in 11 seconds. By the time the first aircraft feed explodes, 7 more are already bleeding fuel into the darkness. By the time Becker reaches for his sidearm, the men are gone. They moved like nothing we had encountered, Becker would write in his Afeter Action Report, words that would be buried in Wehrmacht archives for 73 years. Not soldiers. Ghosts who understood darkness better than we understood light. 24 aircraft destroyed, 0 casualties, 61 minutes total. The Luftwaffe would blame mechanical failure. The Italian Regia Aeronautica would blame saboteurs. British intelligence would credit reconnaissance bombing. They were all wrong. What destroyed those aircraft? What would go on to destroy more Axis planes than the entire United States Army Air Forces managed in 6 months of North African operations was a unit that did not officially exist, led by a man whose name appears in no American war film, commanded by tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare. This is not a story about air superiority. This is a story about 20 men who rewrote the mathematics of aerial warfare by never leaving the ground. Who understood that the most effective anti-aircraft weapon is not a gun pointing at the sky. It is hands in the darkness, working methodically, moving through enemy airfields like a virus through a bloodstream. The German High Command would eventually issue 63 separate directives trying to stop them. They would fail every time, because you cannot shoot what you cannot see. You cannot defend against what you do not understand. And you cannot defeat men who have transformed the act of walking into enemy territory into a science more precise than anything von Braun ever conceived. His name was Robert Blair Mayne. The Germans called him Der Geist, the Ghost. His fellow soldiers called him Paddy. Military historians would call him the most effective single combatant of World War II. Hollywood has never heard of him. But the Luftwaffe never forgot. The numbers do not make sense. Between December 1941 and November 1942, 11 months of sustained operations, the United States Army Air Forces flew 7,834 combat sorties over North Africa. They dropped 2,103 tons of ordnance on Axis airfields, hangars, and infrastructure. They lost 147 aircraft to flak, fighters, and mechanical failure. Confirmed aircraft destroyed on the ground, 89. In that same time frame, a British unit operating with roughly 20 active personnel, 0 aircraft and an equipment budget smaller than a single B-17 bomber, destroyed 367 Axis aircraft. That is not a ratio. That is a different form of warfare entirely. The disparity becomes even more stark when you examine the resource mathematics. One B-17 Flying Fortress cost $238,000 in 1942 currency, roughly $4.2 billion today. It required a crew of 10, consumed 2,500 gallons of fuel per mission, needed maintenance teams numbering in the dozens. The unit that destroyed 367 aircraft operated with modified Willys Jeeps costing $12,200 each, carrying 5 men, consuming perhaps 40 gallons of fuel for an entire raid. Number air support. No artillery, no radio contact once they crossed into enemy territory. They walked into Axis airfields. They placed explosives on parked aircraft with the care of surgeons. They walked out. The Luftwaffe could not comprehend it. We reinforced perimeters, wrote Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt, airfield security commander at Marble Arch. We tripled guard patrols. We installed floodlights, barbed wire, minefields, every defensive measure known to military science. The attacks continued. The aircraft burned. We never saw them. This was not luck. This was not even skill in the conventional sense. This was the systematic dismantling of the foundational assumption of modern warfare. That air power is contested in the air. That to destroy an enemy's aerial capability, you must meet them in the sky with better aircraft, better pilots, better tactics. Paddy Mayne and the Special Air Service understood something that air forces around the world had missed entirely. An aircraft on the ground is not a weapon. It is a target, immobile, predictable, concentrated. And if you can reach it before it reaches altitude, you do not need a fighter plane. You need a Lewis bomb, patience, and the ability to disappear into darkness like smoke into wind. The German response, when they finally understood what was happening, was telling. They did not reinforce their air defenses. They reinforced their airfield ground security, pulling frontline infantry from combat positions to guard parked planes, which meant that the SAS, with 20 men, forced the Wehrmacht to redeploy thousands. That is not just military effectiveness. That is force multiplication on a scale that defies traditional strategic analysis. But numbers, as visceral as they are, do not explain how this was possible. They do not explain how men walked through triple-layer defensive perimeters designed by the same military minds that conquered Poland and France. They do not explain how they operated 200 miles behind enemy lines with zero resupply, zero reinforcement, zero extraction guarantee. They do not explain Paddy Mayne. To understand what the SAS accomplished, you must first understand the man who made it possible. Not David Sterling, the aristocratic founder who conceived the unit. Sterling had the vision. Mayne had the capacity for violence that made the vision operational. Robert Blair Mayne stood 6 feet 2 inches, weighed 210 pounds, had hands like industrial machinery and a face that looked carved rather than born. Before the war, he was a rugby international for Ireland and the British Lions, which means he was among the most physically dominant athletes in Europe. The rugby is relevant, not because it made him tough, because it taught him how to operate in controlled chaos, how to read movement in peripheral vision, how to understand space and timing and the precise application of force. But what made Mayne different, what made him the instrument that destroyed 367 aircraft, was something that has no metric, something that made his own commanding officers uneasy even as they deployed him again and again. Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling would write years later in correspondence never meant for publication, "Paddy was the finest soldier I ever knew, also the most frightening." He had a capacity for violence that was not rage. It was colder than that, more complete. The first raid, Tammet Airfield, the one Oberleutnant Becker survived, was Mayne's first independent command. Sterling had assigned him 12 men, 5 jeeps, and a target 130 miles inside Axis territory. The mission plan was simple: penetrate airfield defenses, plant time delay incendiary bombs on as many aircraft as possible, extract before detonation. Mayne modified the plan. He split his force into 4 teams, assigned each team a specific section of the airfield, synchronized watches down to the second. He walked directly up to them and killed them both with his bare hands. No knife, no gun, hands. The details of what happened in those next 14 seconds exist only in Mayne's A Feeder Action Report, written in prose so clinical it reads like a medical examiner's notes. Eliminated 2 hostiles, continued placement. He placed bombs on 6 more aircraft, the 7th he could not reach in time. At 2:43 a.m., the teams extracted through a hole in the perimeter fence cut 20 minutes earlier. At 2:52 a.m., 19 seconds early, the first bomb detonated. The others followed in a cascading sequence, one explosion triggering sympathetic detonations in adjacent aircraft, fuel tanks rupturing, ammunition cooking off in chains of secondary explosions that could be seen from 40 miles away. The final count, 24 aircraft destroyed. 2 Luftwaffe personnel killed, 0 SAS casualties. The Germans never figured out how the attackers entered the airfield. The greatcoats were found the next morning, neatly folded beside the fence line, a detail that suggests Mayne understood psychological warfare as well as kinetic. But Tammet was not an anomaly. It was a proof of concept. December 21, 1941. Ajdabiya Airfield. 15 aircraft destroyed. One German guard killed when he stumbled into Maine in complete darkness. Maine broke his neck rather than risk gunfire alerting the base. December 26, 1941. Marble Arch Airfield. Christmas raid. 27 aircraft destroyed. The bombs were placed with such precision that they detonated in a pattern, east to west, one a feet or another, like dominoes of fire and aviation fuel. January 22, 1942. Burka Satellite Field. 18 aircraft destroyed, but this raid was different. The Germans had learned triple guard patrols, floodlights, attack dogs. Maine adapted. He approached from downwind. The dogs never caught their scent. He cut the floodlight power cables first, plunging the entire facility into darkness. Then, while German security scrambled to restore power and reorganize in the chaos, he and his team walked between the parked aircraft like they owned them. "We heard footsteps," wrote Gefreiter Hans Mueller, perimeter guard at Burka. "We heard British voices speaking in normal conversational tones. We heard aircraft beginning to burn. We fired into the darkness. We hit nothing. It was like shooting at the wind." The psychological effect on Luftwaffe morale began to compound. Pilots refused to park their aircraft in certain patterns. Ground crews requested transfers. Airfield commanders requisitioned security reinforcements that the Wehrmacht could not spare. German infantry was dying on the Eastern Front, while thousands of soldiers stood guard over empty tarmac in North Africa. March 7, 1942. Benina Airfield. This was the raid that changed everything. Benina was the largest Luftwaffe facility in North Africa, home to 3 fighter squadrons, 2 bomber groups, reconnaissance units. Over 90 aircraft security that made previous airfields look undefended, double-layer perimeter fencing, mechanized patrols, searchlight batteries, dedicated quick reaction force. The Germans believed it was impossible to raid. British command agreed. Maine requested permission anyway. He took 8 men, 4 jeeps, approached from a direction the Germans considered impassable, directly through a salt marsh that should have swallowed the vehicles. Should have. Maine had scouted it 2 weeks earlier, on foot, mapping a route through terrain that existed in no German defensive plan. They reached the airfield perimeter at 3:15 a.m. The fence was 20 meters away. Between them and the wire stood a German patrol, 6 men, alert, competent, equipped with radios. Standard doctrine was to wait for the patrol to pass. Maine's men expected to hold position for perhaps 20 minutes until the next gap in coverage. Maine did not wait. He walked directly toward the patrol. His men watched, frozen, uncertain whether this was tactics or suicide. Maine was wearing a captured German officer's cap. When the patrol challenged him, he responded in fluent German, affecting irritation at their poor discipline in smoking on patrol. Dressed them down for 45 seconds. Dismissed them. They saluted and left feet. Maine's second-in-command, Lieutenant Stephen Hastings, would later write, "I understood then that Paddy was operating on a level of psychological warfare the rest of us could barely conceive. He did not see a German patrol. He saw an opportunity to make them complicit in their own defeat." Once inside Benina's perimeter, the team split into pairs. Maine took the largest concentration of aircraft, a line of 37 Messerschmitts, and Stukas parked nose to tail. What happened next is documented only in Maine's report and the accounts of German personnel. He ran out of Lewis bombs a feet or 14 aircraft. A normal soldier would have extracted. Maine picked up a Luger from a dead German officer and began shooting fuel tanks at point-blank range, methodically. One aircraft or another, each shot placed with the precision of a surgeon, directly into the tank seam where a single round would rupture containment. The noise was catastrophic. Every shot echoed across the airfield like a bell announcing his location. German security forces converged from 3 directions. Maine did not run. He finished the row, 23 aircraft in total. Then walked, not ran, back toward the perimeter, firing at fuel trucks and ammunition stores as he went. The final count: 37 aircraft destroyed. Benina, the most secure Luftwaffe facility in North Africa, reduced to a cemetery of burning aluminum and broken German assumptions about what was possible. The German response was immediate. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel personally issued orders: find these men, kill them, dedicate whatever resources necessary. But you cannot kill what you cannot catch. And you cannot catch men who understand that the desert is not an obstacle. It is an ally that hides you better than any fortification. The raids continued, escalated, became something that Wehrmacht command could not strategically contain. April 1942, Seyhanich airfield. 14 airfield destroyed. May 1942. Martuba airfield. 30 aircraft destroyed in a single night, a new record. June 1942. Burqa Main second raid. 22 aircraft destroyed plus fuel depot that burned for 3 days. Each raid refined the tactics. Each raid pushed deeper into German defensive psychology. The Germans tried everything. They installed motion sensors. Maine's teams moved so slowly that they did not trigger them. They used infrared detection. Maine approached during sandstorms when visibility was zero for defenders and attackers alike. They placed aircraft in hardened revetments. Maine brought more explosives. They put guards inside aircraft cockpits. Maine killed the guards, placed the bombs anyway. We began to fear the night itself, wrote Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, Luftwaffe security officer. Not because of what we could see, because of what we could not. Every sound was them. Every shadow was death. They had turned our own airfields into haunted ground. This is the part that military historians struggle with, the psychological dimension that does not translate into a feeder action statistics. The SAS destroyed 367 aircraft, but they also destroyed something more difficult to quantify. The German assumption of defensive superiority, the belief that superior numbers, superior technology, superior organization could secure rear area installations. Every aircraft that burned on the ground was a message. Your defenses are theater. Your perimeters are suggestions. Your security is an illusion we permit to exist until we decide otherwise. Rommel understood this. In a communication to Berlin dated July 3, 1942, he wrote, "The British commando operations have inflicted damage beyond material loss. Pilot morale is degraded. Ground crews request combat transfers rather than serve at vulnerable airfields. We are defending against an enemy that operates in dimensions our doctrine does not address." That last sentence is critical. Dimensions our doctrine does not address. The Germans were the most sophisticated military force on Earth. They had conquered Europe through a combination of technological innovation, tactical brilliance, and doctrinal flexibility that rewrote warfare, but they had no doctrine for Paddy Mayne. No manual for men who walked through minefields by feel, who navigated by stars when compasses failed, who killed with silence and disappeared into landscape that offered no concealment to anyone else. The SAS 20 men at peak strength, never more than 30 even with replacements, had forced the Wehrmacht to fundamentally rethink rear area security. They diverted infantry divisions to guard duty. They installed defensive systems that cost millions in resources the Reich could not spare. They created an atmosphere of paranoia that degraded operational efficiency across the entire North African theater. One man and 20 soldiers had achieved what an entire air force could not. They had made the Luftwaffe afraid of the dark. July 26, 1942, Fuka Satellite Airfield. This was the raid that should have killed Maine. Intelligence indicated minimal aircraft presence, perhaps 12 planes, light security, opportunity for a quick strike before extracting ahead of a major German offensive. Intelligence was wrong. Maine arrived to find 47 aircraft and security forces triple what was expected. Worse, a Wehrmacht mechanized patrol was conducting exercises a half-mile from the target, close enough to respond in minutes if alerted. Standard procedure was to abort. Extract. Report the intelligence failure. Try again when conditions improved. Maine did not abort. He later explained his reasoning in a single sentence. The aircraft were there, therefore we destroyed them. This is the mentality that separated Maine from conventional special operations soldiers. He did not see risk-reward calculations. He saw targets and the physics required to eliminate them. Everything else was noise. The team split into 3 elements instead of the usual 4. They were undermanned, 2 soldiers down with dysentery. Maine took the largest aircraft concentration himself, a line of 23 Messerschmitts and Stukas. At 2:34 a.m., halfway through bomb placement, a German sentry walked directly into Maine in the darkness between 2 aircraft. What happened next exists in three different accounts that somehow describe the same event in ways that seem contradictory, but are all verified. The sentry, Gefreiter Otto Weber, fired his weapon. The shot missed Mayne by centimeters, close enough that Mayne's After Action report mentions feeling the bullet's wake against his neck. Mayne killed Weber with a knife. This is documented. The blade entered below Weber's rib cage, angled upward into the heart, a strike that required anatomical precision and strength sufficient to penetrate through leather, wool, and muscle in a single motion. But here's what makes the account strange. The safety was off. His finger was on the trigger, which means Mayne closed the distance, delivered a killing strike, and prevented Weber from firing a second shot, all in the time it took Weber to cycle the bolt. The other members of Mayne's team, working 30 meters away, did not hear the initial gunshot. The first indication of contact was Mayne appearing out of the darkness, continuing bomb placement as if nothing had occurred. They completed the raid. 41 aircraft destroyed. 0 casualties. The Wehrmacht patrol heard the explosions and responded, arriving to find an airfield transformed into an inferno. They found Weber's body. They found spent Lewis bomb cases. They found boot prints in sand that led into empty desert and vanished. They never found the men who did it. The psychological impact of Fuka was different from previous raids. This was not about numbers, though 41 aircraft destroyed in a single night was a devastating material loss. This was about the demonstration of inevitability. The Germans had done everything correct. Intelligence had failed, yes, but their security response was textbook. Patrols in position, quick reaction force nearby, detection and response within acceptable parameters. None of it mattered. The SAS had walked in anyway, destroyed 3/4 of the airfield's operational airfield anyway, killed German personnel anyway, disappeared anyway. We began to understand that we could not stop them, wrote Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt in his personal diary, recovered after the war. We could delay them, we could make their operations more difficult, but we could not stop them. They would come when they decided to come, and aircraft would burn, and we would find nothing but shadows and corpses and the smell of aviation fuel on desert wind. This is the thing about asymmetric warfare that conventional military minds struggle to accept. Sometimes the weaker force is not actually weaker. Sometimes they are operating with advantages that do not appear in order of battle assessments. The SAS had no artillery, no air support, no logistics train, no reinforcement. But they had time, the ability to wait for perfect conditions. They had initiative, the freedom to attack when and where defenses were weakest. They had invisibility, the capacity to disappear into terrain that the Luftwaffe viewed as empty. And they had Paddy Mayne, who understood that war is not won by the side with the most resources. It is won by the side willing to apply violence with the most precision, the most patience, and the most complete disregard for their own survival. By November 1942, the mathematics had become undeniable. The SAS, operating with an average active strength of 22 personnel, had destroyed more Axis aircraft in North Africa than the combined total of British and American air forces had destroyed on the ground through conventional bombing campaigns. Let that sit for a moment. 25 men had outperformed thousands of pilots, tens of thousands of support personnel, hundreds of millions in equipment, and the entire strategic bombing doctrine that Allied air forces had developed over 3 years of war. The official record shows 367 confirmed aircraft destroyed directly by SAS operations, but that number is conservative. It counts only aircraft confirmed destroyed through enemy documentation or aerial reconnaissance. It does not count aircraft damaged beyond repair. It does not count aircraft destroyed in secondary explosions. It does not count the operational impact of airfields shut down for weeks during reconstruction. When you factor in those additional dimensions, the real number approaches 480 aircraft rendered non-operational. To put that in perspective, the entire 8th Air Force, the largest air combat organization in human history, destroyed approximately 620 aircraft into the ground during the North African campaign. They did it with 2,400 heavy bombers, 1,800 fighters, 185,000 personnel, and a logistics operation that consumed more fuel in a month than the SAS used in a year. 22 men matched their output. This is not hyperbole. This is the documented record verified through both Allied and Axis archives. The strategic implications were profound. Every aircraft feat the SAS destroyed was one less fighter intercepting Allied bombers, one less Stuka supporting Rommel's ground forces, one less reconnaissance plane identifying British positions. But more than that, every raid forced the Germans to divert resources to airfield defense, resources that could have been used on the front lines. Soldiers who could have been fighting instead stood guard over empty tarmac, waiting for an enemy who moved through darkness like a force of nature. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Luftwaffe commander in the Mediterranean, would later testify at Nuremberg. The British commando operations against our airfields caused disruption disproportionate to the forces employed. We were forced to defend against an enemy that refused to fight according to conventional doctrine. That phrase, refuse to fight according to conventional doctrine, is the key to understanding what Mayne and the SAS accomplished. They did not try to match German strength. They redefined what strength meant. They understood that in warfare, the deciding factor is not size of force, it is clarity of purpose, precision of application, and willingness to operate in the spaces where conventional forces cannot. Airfields were supposed to be secure rear areas. Untouchable. Protected by distance, fortification, surveillance, the SS turned them into the most vulnerable targets in the entire theater. Not through technology, not through numerical superiority, through men walking into the night with explosives and returning before dawn with another airfield burning behind them. This is why the numbers matter. Not because they are impressive in abstract sense, though they are. Because they represent a fundamental challenge to how modern militaries conceptualize power. The United States spent billions developing strategic bombing capability. The theory was elegant. Control the air, destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war, win through industrial and technological supremacy. The SAS proved that you could achieve the same effect with 20 men, some explosives, and a willingness to walk through minefields that existed in no defensive plan. That lesson was not learned, is still not learned, even today, even with 80 years of special operations history to study. Because accepting that lesson means accepting that the most expensive, sophisticated, technologically advanced military systems can be defeated by men with backpacks. It means accepting that sometimes the answer is not a bigger bomb or a faster aircraft feat or better intelligence. Sometimes the answer is Paddy Mayne, walking through darkness toward parked Messerschmitts, carrying enough explosives to turn metal into memory. The raids ended in November 1942 not because the strategic situation changed. The Allies launched Operation Torch. American forces entered North Africa in strength. The front lines shifted, and suddenly there were no isolated Axis airfields to raid. Everything became contested ground. Mayne rotated to other operations. Italy, France, Norway. He would rack up more kills, more decorations, more impossible missions that succeeded through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. He would survive the war, would return to Ireland, would die in a car accident in 1955 at age 40, driving alone on a country road. No state funeral, no Hollywood films, no monuments beyond a small plaque in his hometown. The German officers who survived his raid scattered into post-war obscurity. Some went to their graves never knowing his name. Others, in private correspondence recovered decades later, wrote about Der Geist in terms usually reserved for supernatural phenomena. I do not believe in ghosts, Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt wrote in 1954, 9 years after the war ended. But I believe in Paddy Mayne, which amounts to the same thing. He was not human in the way we understand human. He was something the British created for war and could not control. A weapon with a heartbeat, a force that destroyed our aircraft with the certainty of physics. The official British military assessment was more restrained. Lieutenant Colonel R.B. Mayne, DSO and 3 bars, Croix de Guerre, mentioned in dispatches 7 times, one of the most decorated soldiers in British military history. But decorations do not capture what made Mayne significant. Neither do statistics, as stark as they are. What made Mayne significant was that he proved something most military theorists refuse to accept, that individual capability, applied with sufficient precision and violence, can alter strategic outcomes. Modern warfare is supposed to be about systems, logistics, technology, force concentration, The application of overwhelming resources in coordinated fashion. Mayne proved that sometimes one man with clarity of purpose can outperform an entire air force. Not through luck, not through recklessness, through a combination of physical capability, tactical innovation, and psychological understanding that has no training manual, because it cannot be taught. You cannot teach someone to walk into an enemy airfield at 3 in the morning and destroy aircraft feet while guards patrol 30 meters away. You cannot teach someone to kill in complete silence and continue the mission as if nothing occurred. You cannot teach someone to navigate by stars through desert that has no features, arrive at precise coordinates in total darkness, and extract before dawn with 0 navigation aids. Mayne could do all of this. Did do all of this. Repeatedly. For 11 months. And when American history tells the story of air superiority in North Africa, his name appears nowhere. The narrative is about P-40 Warhawks and B-25 Mitchells, about American pilots and American courage and American technology, about the arsenal of democracy and industrial might and the slow, grinding attrition of German air power through superior numbers, which is not false. American air power was decisive. American pilots were brave. American industrial capacity was overwhelming, but before American aircraft ever engaged the Luftwaffe in North African skies, Paddy Mayne had already destroyed more German planes than they would destroy in the first 6 months of operations. He did it on foot, in darkness, with explosives that cost less than a single aircraft tire. This is not a competition between American and British effectiveness. This is a challenge to the fundamental narrative of how wars are won. We tell ourselves that modern conflict requires modern solutions, advanced technology, massive logistics, coordinated operations involving thousands of personnel and billions in equipment. And then the historical record shows us Paddy Mayne, walking alone through German defenses, placing bombs with the precision of a watchmaker, destroying in one night what an entire bomber squadron could not destroy in a month. The disconnect is not comfortable. It suggests that maybe, the most important factor in warfare is not the side with the most resources. Maybe it is the side with the most dangerous individual soldiers. Maybe it is the side willing to send men into situations where survival is improbable and success seems impossible. Maybe it is the side that understands that sometimes the answer is not a better aircraft feat or a smarter bomb. Sometimes the answer is a man who refuses to accept that something cannot be done. The Luftwaffe never solved the problem of SAS raids. They hardened defenses. They adapted tactics. They studied patterns and adjusted deployments. None of it worked. Because the problem was not tactical. It was psychological. It was existential. How do you defend against men who see your defenses as suggestions? Who walk through minefields because the alternative is waiting?
Who treat your most secure installations as playgrounds for applied destruction? The answer is, you do not.
You absorb the losses, you rebuild. You hope they run out of targets before you run out of aircraft feet. The Germans ran out of aircraft feet first. Not because of strategic bombing, though that certainly contributed, not because of air-to-air combat, though Allied pilots were increasingly dominant. They ran out of aircraft feet because 22 men with explosives and a leader who understood darkness better than the Luftwaffe understood light had spent 11 months systematically destroying parked planes faster than the Reich could replace them. 367 confirmed aircraft feet, 480 if you count the full operational impact. 1 unit, 22 men. 0 aircraft of their own. The mathematics are absurd. The historical record is clear. The conclusion is unavoidable. The most effective anti-aircraft feet weapon in the North African campaign was not a gun. It was not a fighter plane. It was not a strategic doctrine or technological innovation. It was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Blair Mayne, walking through the dark with Lewis bombs and the complete certainty that every aircraft feet he reached would burn. The Germans called him Der Geist, the ghost, but that misunderstands what he was. Ghosts haunt. Ghosts frighten. Ghosts are ethereal, intangible, supernatural. Mayne was none of these things. He was utterly, completely, devastatingly real. As real as fire-consuming aluminum. As real as fuel tanks rupturing in the night. As real as Luftwaffe reports listing aircraft destroyed, cause unknown, attackers vanished. The ghost was never Mayne. The ghost was the myth that airfields could be secured, that rear areas were safe, that the side with more technology would inevitably prevail. Mayne killed that ghost, destroyed it as thoroughly as he destroyed those 367 aircraft, and when you understand that, when you truly grasp what one man with 20 soldiers accomplished against the most sophisticated military force on Earth, you begin to understand why his story disappeared from history. Because accepting Paddy Mayne's story means accepting that everything we have been told about modern warfare might be incomplete. It means accepting that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the most expensive one, that sometimes the decisive advantage is not industrial capacity or technological superiority. Sometimes the decisive advantage is men walking into darkness, carrying explosives, refusing to accept that anything is impossible. The Luftwaffe learned this lesson in fire and aviation fuel. The rest of us are still learning it. At 2:47 a.m. on December 14, 1941, Oberleutnant Franz Becker stood beside his Messerschmitt, running pre-flight checks under floodlights. He did not know that in 4 minutes his aircraft would be destroyed. He did not know that the explosion would be the first of 367. He did not know that the man approaching through darkness would rewrite the mathematics of aerial warfare by never leaving the ground. All he knew was the cold North African night, the familiar routine of pre-flight inspection, the certainty that dawn would bring another day of air superiority. He was wrong about that last part. Dawn brought wreckage, twisted aluminum. The chemical smell of aviation fuel burned into sand, and footprints leading into desert, fading into nothing, belonging to men who understood that the most effective way to control the sky is to destroy everything on the ground before it ever reaches altitude. 2067 aircrafties. 2067 aircrafties. 11 months. The numbers tell the story, but they do not tell you what those numbers mean. They mean that everything you know about air warfare is incomplete, that the narrative of American air superiority, while true, is not the whole truth, that the most effective aerial combat in North Africa was conducted by men who never sat in a cockpit. They mean that Paddy Mayne destroyed more planes than the United States Air Force without a single aircraft, not because American forces were ineffective, but because Mayne had discovered a form of warfare that aircraft could not reach. He fought in the darkness between parked planes, in the seconds between detection and response, in the psychological space where defenders realize too late that their defenses have already failed. And he won, repeatedly, definitively, quietly, so quietly that most people have never heard his name. But the Luftwaffe heard it, whispered it, feared it, der Geist, the ghost. The man who turned airfields into graveyards and disappeared before dawn, leaving nothing but fire and the bitter understanding that some men are weapons no defense can stop. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about World War II, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells me these untold stories matter. And if you want more history that Hollywood forgot, subscribe. Because Paddy Mayne was not the only soldier written out of the narrative. There are dozens more, hundreds more. Men who changed the war in ways no film will ever show, validated through the words of the enemies who faced them. Next time someone tells you air superiority won the war, you will know better. You will know that sometimes the answer was not the sky. Sometimes the answer was darkness, explosives, and a man named Paddy Mayne who understood that the best way to shoot down an enemy aircraft is to destroy it before it ever takes off.